This happened in July of last year, during a time when everything in my life felt like it was falling apart. My house was having serious electrical problems, and I was left without power for several days while repairs were being done. I worked from home, so living without electricity wasn't just uncomfortable, it made working impossible. Eventually, I had no choice but to rent an Airbnb and stay somewhere else until the power came back on. I don't live in a big city, so my options were limited. The closest affordable Airbnb was about a 45-minute drive away, in a smaller, more secluded part of the city that people usually described as not the best area. I told myself it was only for a few days, and the money I was saving made it worth it. By the time I arrived, I was exhausted. I went inside, locked the door behind me, and pretty much went straight to bed without really thinking much about the place. The next morning, I woke up early and started setting up my laptop and workspace. Just before I was supposed to start work, there was a knock at the front door. I froze. It was my house, and I hadn't been expecting anyone. For a moment, I considered not answering at all. Eventually, I figured it might be the host or someone related to the property, so I walked up and checked through the peephole. Standing on the porch was a man in his early 30s, covered in tattoos. He didn't look like a host, he didn't look like a delivery driver or a salesperson either. Something about him immediately made me uncomfortable. I didn't open the door. I quietly stepped away and went back to my desk. I worked most of the day without leaving my chair. Meetings, emails, deadlines, it kept me distracted. By the time I stopped working, it was already around 8 p.m. I went out briefly to grab dinner and came back to eat. Only a few minutes after I sat down, there was another knock at the door. This time I already knew who it was. When I checked, it was the same tattooed man. Now I was annoyed more than scared. What could he possibly want from me? I still didn't open the door. I ignored him again and went back to eating. After dinner, I decided to work for another hour. I put my headphones on and focused completely. When I finally closed my laptop, I realized how dark it had gotten. The glow from my screen had been the only light on in the house. I stood up and turned on the hallway light. That's when my entire body went cold. There were shoe prints on the floor, faint but clear. They ran down the hallway, and some of them led right up behind the desk where I had been sitting. I slowly followed them, my heart pounding, until they led to the back door. It was cracked open. Before I could even process what I was seeing, I heard footsteps coming down the stairs, slow, careful. Then a man stepped into the hallway and looked directly at me. It was him, the tattooed man. For a split second, he looked surprised, then his face changed. All emotion drained away and was replaced by pure anger. I tried to speak, but nothing came out. My heart was racing so hard it hurt. I turned and ran. I sprinted out the back door, through the yard, and into a line of trees behind the houses. I crouched behind a tree, pulled out my phone, and started dialing 911, but stopped when I heard footsteps running toward me. I held my breath as the footsteps passed right by my hiding spot and disappeared into the darkness. When it was safe, I contacted the police and went back to their Airbnb to wait for them. I gave them a detailed description, especially the tattoos. The next day they found him. It was confirmed to be the same man. Police later told me he had broken into several homes in the days before and had done terrible things to the people inside. I don't know what he was planning to do to me. I don't know why he waited, but I know one thing for sure. If I had opened that door even once, I probably wouldn't be telling this story. I was driving across the country on a pretty hectic road trip. I had work-related things to take care of at an office in Maine, and since I was already making the drive, I decided to turn it into a longer trip and visit friends and family along the East Coast afterward. It was one of those trips where every day blurred together, long hours behind the wheel, unfamiliar roads, and random stops just to stay awake. On the fourth day of driving, I spent most of my time going through Pennsylvania. There were a few nice towns scattered along the way, but for the most part, the drive was empty. To reach my destination, my GPS kept taking me onto long, narrow side roads, one-lane highways that seemed to stretch on forever through nothing but trees and fields. As it started getting late, the weather turned bad. Rain began coming down hard, and fog rolled in thick enough that I could barely see ahead of me. Around the same time, I noticed my fuel gauge dropping dangerously low. I hadn't passed a gas station in a long time, but I kept telling myself there had to be one coming up soon. 30 more minutes went by, and my anxiety kept growing. Just when I was starting to think I might actually run out of gas in the middle of nowhere, I saw a sign through the fog advertising a gas station. A moment later, I spotted it ahead of me. It was tucked off the side of the road, surrounded by trees. The place was tiny, only two pumps and a small concession building behind them. I didn't like the look of it, but I didn't have a choice. I pulled in and parked. Rain poured down as I got out and opened my gas tank. I lifted the pump, tried to insert my card, nothing. The screen was dark. I wiped it off and tried again, still nothing. I moved to the second pump, same thing. Both were completely dead. Frustrated and confused, I looked around. The rain, the fog, and the fading light made it hard to see much, but the station definitely looked old and neglected. At first, I thought maybe it was just outdated equipment. Plenty of rural gas stations look rough. Then I noticed a light on inside the concession building. Relieved, I assumed someone was working inside and could help me. I ran from under the pump canopy to the building, grabbed the handle, and pulled the door open. It let out a loud screech as it moved. The moment I stepped inside, my stomach dropped. The shelves were completely empty. Some were knocked over. The place looked trashed, like it had been abandoned or destroyed long ago. The light wasn't from a ceiling fixture either. It was coming from somewhere in the back like a lamp. I didn't stay more than a few seconds. Whatever was going on here, I knew it wasn't normal. I backed out into the rain and turned toward my car. That's when I saw someone standing next to it. They were drenched from head to toe, just standing there peering into my windows. My heart jumped into my throat. "Hey, what are you doing?" I shouted as I rushed toward them. The person snapped their head toward me, then looked past me toward the building. I turned around just in time to see the front door open and a man step out into the rain. He had long black hair plastered to his face and looked sickly, almost unnatural. The second he saw me, he didn't hesitate. He started running straight at me. The person by my car backed away, but the man charging at me didn't slow down. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and locked it. He reached my car just as I started the engine and yanked at the handle. As I pulled away, I heard a loud metallic scrape tear across the side of my car. I floored it and didn't look back. About 30 minutes later, my car finally ran out of gas. Somehow, I had enough cell service to call for help. While waiting, I stepped outside and noticed a long, deep scratch carved across my car door. It looked like it had been done with a knife. Later that night, police informed me that the gas station I had stopped at hadn't been in service for over a decade. What would have happened if I stayed even a minute longer is something I don't like to think about. This happened a few years ago when I was still living in a small town in the Midwest. Growing up there was much to do, so my friends and I always found ways to entertain ourselves. One thing my friend Chris and I started doing during our last year of high school was exploring abandoned places around town. It started with small stuff, old barns, empty storage buildings, things like that. Eventually we got more confident and began checking out abandoned houses that sat on the outskirts of town. There were a surprising number of them, especially on back roads where farms had been left behind. Most of the time it was harmless. We'd walk through, take pictures, and leave. It was more about the thrill of being somewhere we probably weren't supposed to be. One afternoon in late fall, Chris texted me saying he found a whole group of abandoned houses about 20 minutes outside town. Apparently they used to belong to families that worked on a nearby farm decades ago, but when the farm shut down, everyone moved away. The houses had just been left there. We drove out there that same evening. The place felt strange the moment we arrived. There were about 4 houses scattered along a dirt road, all of them in rough shape. Broken windows, sagging porches, weeds growing everywhere. It looked like time had completely forgotten the place. We started with the first house closest to the road. It was exactly what you'd expect, dust everywhere, old furniture left behind, wallpaper peeling off the walls. We walked through each room, shining our flashlights around, joking about how creepy it looked. The second house was basically the same. By the time we reached the third one, the sun was starting to go down. Chris suggested we make this the last one before heading back. The front door was already hanging half open. When we pushed it the rest of the way, it creaked so loudly it echoed through the entire house. Inside, the air felt heavy. It smelled damp and stale, like it hadn't been touched in years. Our footsteps echoed as we moved from room to room. Everything looked frozen in time, old cabinets, broken chairs, even dishes still sitting in the kitchen sink. Then Chris stopped suddenly. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I listened. At first there was nothing. Then we heard it, a slow thump coming from somewhere upstairs. Chris and I looked at each other. The obvious explanation was that it was just the house settling, or maybe an animal moving around in the attic. Still, something about the sound made my chest tighten. Another thump. This time it sounded heavier. Chris, being the braver one between us, started toward the staircase. I followed behind him, my flashlight shaking slightly in my hand. The stairs creaked under our weight as we climbed them. When we reached the top, we saw a hallway with 3 closed doors. That's when we heard breathing, not ours, someone else's. It was faint, but definitely there, slow, steady breathing coming from the room at the end of the hall. Chris slowly walked toward it. Every step felt louder than the last. When he reached the door, he pushed it open just a few inches. The room was dark. He swung the door wider and pointed his flashlight inside. For a moment we didn't see anything. Then the beam landed on the corner of the room, and we saw a man standing there. He was facing the wall, completely still, like he'd been standing there the entire time. His clothes were filthy and his hair hung down over his face. The moment the flashlight hit him, he slowly turned his head toward us. The look on his face is something I'll never forget. He didn't look surprised. He looked angry. Chris slammed the door shut instantly and yelled, "RUN." We bolted down the stairs so fast I nearly slipped. Behind us, we heard the bedroom door slam open and heavy footsteps coming after us. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. Chris jumped into the driver's seat while I slammed the passenger door shut. Just as the engine started, the front door of the house burst open. The man stepped onto the porch and stared at us as we sped away. He didn't chase us. He just stood there watching. We never went back to those houses again. A few weeks later, I told someone in town about what happened. They mentioned that people sometimes used those abandoned homes as places to hide out. Looking back now, I realize something that still creeps me out. That man didn't react like we had surprised him. It felt more like he had been waiting for someone to come inside. This happened while I was backpacking through a remote route I found in the Cascades. It was an out and back trail that usually takes about 3 days to hike one way and another 3 days to return. I didn't know much about how popular it was, but from past experience, long multi-day routes like that are usually pretty quiet. You might see 1 or 2 people at most. On my 3rd day out, I passed through a campsite and noticed a man sitting near his tent. He looked normal enough, mid-30s maybe, calm, friendly. I stopped to take a short break and we talked for a while. He told me he was planning to stay at that campsite for the night and then continue on to the peak of the trail the following day. I told him that was exactly where I was heading that same day and joked that I'd probably see him up there. I left shortly after and continued hiking. When I reached what would be my campsite for the next 2 nights, I was blown away by the view. It was easily the most beautiful place I'd ever camped. I decided to take a full rest day there and hike the peak without my pack. The entire day went by without a single person passing through. When night came, I was still completely alone. That night, I thought about the guy I'd met the day before. He'd said he would be reaching the peak that day, but he never showed up. I figured he must have changed plans, turned back, or stayed another night where he was. It didn't seem that strange at the time. The next morning, I packed up and started hiking back down the trail. I got a late start and was moving slower than usual because my body felt sore for no clear reason. By the time I realized how late it was getting, the sun was already starting to set. I put on my headlamp and kept walking. About an hour after sunset, I finally reached the campsite where the man had been staying. His tent was still there. It was set up exactly the same way as before, like he had never left. That immediately felt wrong. Based on what he told me, he should have been long gone by then. Staying in the same campsite for several days on a backpacking route like this is unusual. I called out asking if he was okay. No response. I walked closer and called out again, saying I just wanted to check on him. The flap of his tent was partially open, but nobody was inside. That's when my stomach dropped. My body reacted before my mind could fully catch up. Something wasn't right. I stood there scanning the trees, listening for any sound. Then I saw it, a faint light deep in the woods. It wasn't moving. It was just sitting there, glowing weakly. I slowly walked toward it, stopping about 40 yards from the tents before I reached the source. It was a headlamp lying on the ground. The light was extremely dim, like the batteries were almost dead. And just as I was staring at it, trying to understand why it was there, I felt it, that unmistakable feeling of being watched. I looked up. Someone was standing about 10 yards away, partially hidden in the darkness between the trees. They were trying very hard not to be seen. I knew immediately that this was the man I'd spoken to earlier. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave. Hello. I called out shakily, "Do you need help?" They didn't move, they didn't speak. "I'm sorry," I said quickly. "I'll leave." I backed away, turned, and hurried back to the campsite. Thankfully, I hadn't unpacked anything yet. I threw my backpack on and started walking away as fast as I could without breaking into a run. As I left the campsite, the headlamp in the woods suddenly shut off. I walked another 3 miles that night to the next camp and reported what happened as soon as I was able. Unfortunately, it turned out exactly the way I feared. The man I had met earlier was officially listed as missing. There were almost no traces to follow. In the backcountry, searching for someone like that is nearly impossible. Who that person in the woods was and what really happened out there is something I may never know, but deep down, I think I already understand the most likely answer. This happened about a year ago when I had booked an Airbnb in a town I had never been to before. I was traveling for work and had a meeting with a client early the next day, so I only planned to stay there for one night before driving back home. The drive took around 3 hours, and by the time I arrived, it was already late. The neighborhood was unusually quiet. Most of the houses were dark, and tall trees lined the streets, blocking out what little light there was. As I pulled into the driveway and stepped out of my car, I noticed someone walking down the road in the distance. They were too far away to make out any details, but something about the way they moved gave me a strange feeling. I brushed it off and went inside. The house itself was completely average, nothing fancy, nothing suspicious. I locked the door, set my bags down, and did a quick walkthrough to make sure everything was normal. After that, I pulled my car into the garage just to be safe and went to bed. I slept lightly and woke up several times during the night. When my alarm went off at 4:00 a.m., the sun was still down and the house was completely dark. As I sat up in bed, I noticed something that immediately made my heart sink. Light was coming from under my bedroom door. I knew for a fact I hadn't left any lights on. I slowly got out of bed and walked toward the door. Just before I opened it, I heard movement on the other side, soft sounds like someone shifting things around at the end of the hallway. I opened the door. The living room light was on. My chest tightened as I stepped into the hallway. The sounds continued coming from the living room. When I looked inside, I saw a man kneeling near my bags, digging through them. He was wearing a black hoodie and ripped jeans, the exact same clothes the person I had seen walking down the road earlier that night was wearing. I only stared for a second before he turned around and looked straight at me. He didn't look surprised. If anything, it felt like he had been expecting me. He dropped my bag and yelled at me to stay where I was. That was all I needed to hear. I turned and ran back into the bedroom, slamming the door shut just as he reached it. He rammed into the door and started kicking it, then began messing with the lock on the other side. Panicking, I opened the window and jumped out, running as fast as I could down the street. When police arrived later, the man was gone. My bags were gone too. Even worse, they found that he had managed to pick the bedroom lock and get inside after I escaped. If I had hesitated for even a second longer, I don't think I would have made it out. This happened earlier this spring when I went on a solo camping trip about 4 hours north of where I live. There's a small lake up there that I've gone to several times over the years. It's never crowded, not even on weekends, and most people don't even seem to know it exists. That's why I love it. It's quiet, peaceful, and feels completely cut off from the rest of the world. When I arrived on the first day, I set up my tent and gear along the grassy shoreline. The lake wasn't very big, and because it was surrounded by open beach and then forest beyond that, I could see pretty much everything around me. I felt completely alone, which was exactly what I wanted. Not long after I finished setting up, I noticed a man come out of the woods on the opposite side of the lake. He walked down to the shore and started setting up a tent. He looked like a normal camper. Nothing about him stood out as strange. He kept to himself for a while, and I didn't think much of it. As the sun started to go down, I saw him walking around the edge of the lake toward my campsite. When he got closer, he smiled and introduced himself as William. He said he noticed me across the lake and just wanted to say hi since it wasn't often you ran into anyone else out there. We talked for a bit, and honestly, he seemed like a really cool guy. He was 26, around my age, and said he liked the lake because of how secluded it was. After about half an hour, he headed back to his campsite as it got darker. Nothing strange happened that night. The next day, we ended up hanging out again. We talked for most of the afternoon, shared a six-pack of beers, and just relaxed on the beach. By the time evening rolled around, I actually felt glad I'd met him. He seemed like the kind of person you'd enjoy camping with again sometime. Later that night, I was sitting by my small campfire, getting ready to put it out and head to bed, when I saw William walking toward me from across the lake. His campfire had already gone out, so I assumed he'd been in his tent, but apparently not. When he got closer, something immediately felt off. He smiled and asked if everything was good, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. It felt forced. Then he told me he had found a really cool spot in the woods with an amazing view and asked if I wanted to see it. I told him it was kind of late to be heading out, but he insisted the view was better at night. The way he kept hyping it up made me feel oddly pressured, like saying no would be awkward. I remember thinking, what's the point of camping if you don't check out the cool spots? So I agreed. We walked around the lake and into the woods on the opposite side. There wasn't a trail, just dense trees and uneven ground. William walked confidently, like he knew exactly where he was going. That alone made me uneasy, especially since it was completely dark. After about 50 minutes, he slowed down and pointed ahead, saying this was the spot. When I stepped past him and looked, my stomach dropped. There was no view. Instead, there was an old abandoned RV sitting in a small clearing. It looked like it had been there for years. Moss covered the sides, rust ate through the metal, and parts of it looked barely held together. I turned around to ask William what this was. His face had completely changed. The friendly expression was gone. His face was blank, cold, and empty, like I was looking at a different person. I asked him what this place was, but he didn't answer. That's when I heard the RV's metal door creak open behind me. I didn't even look back. The sound alone sent pure panic through me. I turned and ran as fast as I could into the woods. As I ran, I could hear footsteps, more than one set, chasing after me. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they were going to give out. Eventually the sound stopped, but I didn't slow down. I kept moving, completely lost, until the sky started to lighten and the sun finally came up. When I eventually found my way back to the lake, I stayed hidden in the trees. From there, I could see my campsite. It was gone. My tent, my gear, everything had been removed, like I had never been there at all. I waited until I was sure no one was around, then made my way back to the trail and got to my car. I reported everything to the local police, but nothing ever came of it. I don't know what was planned for me that night, and I don't want to know. But I'm certain of one thing: if I had stayed even a few seconds longer near that RV, I wouldn't be here telling this story. This happened during a road trip I took through Wyoming a couple of years ago. I had been driving for most of the day and was completely exhausted by the time I reached the small town where I'd booked an Airbnb. It was one of those towns where everything shuts down early, no street noise, no traffic, just silence. The Airbnb was a small house on the edge of town. When I pulled up, I remember thinking how dark it was. There were no neighboring houses close by, and the only light came from a single porch bulb over the front door. Still, I was too tired to overthink it. Inside, the place looked clean and normal. I locked the door behind me, dropped my bags, and did a quick check of the rooms. Everything seemed fine. The host had left a note on the counter welcoming me and reminding me to lock up at night. That actually made me feel better. I ate a quick snack, showered, and went to bed. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up for no clear reason. The room was pitch black and the house was completely silent. As I lay there half asleep, I noticed something that immediately made my heart start pounding. I could hear breathing. At first I thought it was my own, but then I realized it was coming from somewhere else in the room. Slow, controlled, definitely not mine. I sat up slowly and listened. The sound was coming from the closet. The door was slightly open. I stared at that crack in the darkness, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. Then the breathing stopped. That somehow made it worse. I reached for my phone on the nightstand and turned the flashlight on, aiming it toward the closet. Inside, pressed into the corner, was a man. He was standing completely still, eyes wide, staring straight back at me. His face was pale and his clothes were dark, blending into the shadows. It looked like he had been there for a long time. We just stared at each other for a second that felt like forever. Then he lunged. I screamed and rolled out of bed, grabbing my phone and sprinting for the door. He chased after me, but I managed to unlock the front door and burst outside barefoot, running into the cold night. I didn't stop until I reached the middle of the road. I called the police with shaking hands, barely able to explain what had happened. By the time officers arrived and searched the house, the man was gone. They found the back window open. The host later told police that nothing like that had ever happened before, but when they checked the house records, they discovered there had been a previous break-in months earlier. Someone had been sleeping inside the house without the owner knowing. I still don't understand how long he'd been in that closet, or how many other guests he might have watched sleep before me. This happened when I was working a late-night side job delivering food. It wasn't DoorDash specifically, but one of those delivery apps where you mostly get orders after midnight, office workers, night shifts, people pulling all-nighters. I actually liked those hours because the roads were empty and things were usually quiet. That night, I got an order around 1:40 a.m. The delivery location was an office building on the outskirts of town. That alone felt strange because most office buildings are completely closed at that hour. Still, the tip was decent and the instructions just said, "Bring to front entrance, call when arrived." The building was one of those old corporate structures, 3 floors, lots of dark windows, surrounded by a mostly empty parking lot. When I pulled in, my headlights were the only light in the entire area. No other cars, no security booth, nothing. I sat there for a moment debating whether to cancel, but then my phone buzzed with a message from the customer. "I'm here, door should be unlocked." That made my stomach tighten. I grabbed the bag and walked up to the front entrance. The glass doors were dark, but when I pulled the handle, one of them actually opened. Inside, the lobby lights were off except for a single dim emergency light near the elevator. The moment I stepped inside, the door closed behind me with a heavy click that echoed way too loudly. I called the number listed on the order. It rang once, then went to voicemail. "Hello," I said quietly, my voice sounding wrong in the huge empty space. No answer. I stood there awkwardly, thinking maybe the person was coming down. That's when I heard footsteps. They were coming from the hallway to my right, slow and deliberate, not rushed, not casual either, just measured. A man stepped into the dim light. He was tall and wearing business clothes, dress pants, a button-up shirt, but no jacket, no badge, nothing that explained why he'd be there at almost 2 a.m. His face looked tired, but his eyes were way too alert. "You the delivery?" he asked. I nodded and held up the bag. He didn't move closer. "Come here," he said instead, gesturing toward the hallway behind him. Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. It wasn't rude or aggressive. It was calm, too calm. I hesitated and said I needed to hand it off in the lobby, company policy and all that. That's when his expression changed. Not angry, just annoyed, like I'd messed up a plan. He sighed and took a step back into the shadows of the hallway. "Just set it down and come inside for a second," he said. "I need to check something." Every instinct in my body screamed at me not to move. I slowly placed the bag on the floor between us and took a step backward toward the door. The man stopped pretending then. His voice dropped. "You shouldn't leave yet. That was enough." I turned, yanked the door open, and ran back to my car. I locked the doors immediately and sat there breathing hard, staring at the building. From inside the lobby, I saw him step into view, standing just behind the glass doors, watching me. He didn't chase me. He didn't wave. He just stood there. I drove off and called support to report the incident. They canceled the order immediately and told me the account had already been flagged for suspicious activity. What still messes with me is this. The office building management later confirmed no one was supposed to be inside that building overnight. No cleaners, no security, no employees. Whoever that man was, he wasn't waiting for food. This happened when I was 19 and working as an Uber driver. I hadn't started college yet and didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life, so driving was how I paid the bills. I preferred night shifts because the roads were quieter and there were fewer drunk passengers to deal with, so that night I planned to work from around 7:00 p.m. until 3:00 a.m. Everything was normal until close to midnight. I had just dropped off a woman from a bar at a house on the far edge of the city, an area that quickly turned into farmland and empty roads. As I pulled away, another ride request came in almost immediately. The pickup location was only about 10 minutes away, but what bothered me was the destination. It was even farther out than where I already was, completely away from the city. I almost declined it, but I told myself one more ride wouldn't hurt. The navigation led me down long, dark roads with no streetlights, surrounded by fields of tall crops blowing in the wind. There were no other cars anywhere, and my headlights barely cut through the darkness. Eventually, the GPS told me to turn onto a narrow dirt road that cut straight through the fields. At the end of it sat a farmhouse on top of a small hill. The house was completely dark. I pulled up and parked in the open grass near the front. No lights turned on, no movement. I waited a few seconds, then lightly tapped the horn to let them know I was there. The sound felt way too loud in the silence. That's when I heard a tap on my passenger window. I jumped in my seat. I hadn't seen anyone walk up. I hadn't even heard footsteps. A man leaned down and looked through the open window, his face appearing out of nowhere. He stared at me for a long second without speaking, his expression completely blank. Finally, I asked if he was the one who ordered the Uber. His eyes shifted to my back seat, slowly scanning it before he nodded. "Can you help me carry something?" he asked, without thinking, and because I was technically at work, I said yes. The second the word left my mouth, I regretted it. He turned and started walking toward the house. I got out of the car and followed him, keeping some distance between us. When he reached the porch, he opened the front door and quickly stepped inside without looking back. I stepped onto the porch. The front door was wide open, revealing a long, dark hallway. No lights were on inside, and the man was nowhere in sight. I couldn't hear footsteps. I couldn't hear anything at all. A heavy feeling settled in my chest. "Hello," I called out, no response. The darkness inside the house felt wrong, like it was swallowing sound. I suddenly realized how trapped I'd be if I stepped inside, how no one would hear me scream, how far away I was from anything resembling help. I backed away slowly, then turned and ran. I jumped back into my car, slammed the door shut, and sped down the dirt road, not stopping until I reached the main highway. I canceled the ride while my hands were still shaking. At the time, I didn't call the police. Nothing had technically happened, and I convinced myself I was overreacting. But that didn't sit right with me. About a month later, curiosity got the better of me. I looked up the address of that farmhouse. The last recorded sale of the property was in the S. No one officially lived there. That means the man I spoke to wasn't the owner, and likely wasn't supposed to be there at all. Whatever he wanted me to help carry, whatever was waiting inside that dark house, I'm convinced it wasn't innocent. And the scariest part is knowing how close I came to walking through that doorway and never coming back out. A few months ago, my wife and I took a short getaway to a remote cabin in Washington state. We wanted a break from city life, somewhere quiet in the middle of nature. The description online made it sound perfect, isolated, peaceful, and far from any other people. We flew in, picked up some groceries, and took a taxi out to the cabin. The ride was over an hour through dense forests and winding mountain roads, which made us even more excited to be completely alone. The cabin itself was small but cozy. The main floor had a kitchen and living room, and a ladder led up to a loft with the bed. The loft was low, so you had to crawl into the bed like in a tiny home. We unpacked, made a quick dinner, opened a bottle of wine, and settled in. Around 11 p.m., we heard footsteps outside in the grass near the cabin. My wife froze. I tried to reassure her. When I looked out the window, everything was pitch black. I turned on the porch light and saw nothing. We shrugged it off and went back to the living room. Then I noticed a shadow moving across the bedroom wall. Slowly, I realized it was not a normal shadow. It moved independently, like something was in there. My heart started pounding. I got up and went toward the bedroom, and the shadow vanished. I stepped inside cautiously. Everything looked normal. I thought maybe it was my imagination, but then the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I went to the closet in the bedroom. It had been locked before, now it was unlocked. I opened it and nothing was inside. Just as I breathed a sigh of relief, I heard it, someone breathing behind me. I turned slowly. A large man stood in the doorway. His face was scratched and dirtied, his clothes torn. He didn't speak. He walked into the bedroom, grabbed a duffel bag from under the bed, and left as silently as he had appeared. We called the police immediately, but by the time help arrived, the man was gone. Everything in the cabin had been disturbed, our belongings rifled through, signs that someone had been living there without our knowledge. The terrifying thought that still haunts me is how close we came to encountering him fully. That cabin, which seemed like paradise online, had hidden someone lurking just inches from where we slept. Whatever he had planned, we were lucky to leave that night alive. A few months ago, I was doing a late-night DoorDash shift, just a few hours, mostly to make some extra money. Around 1 a.m., I picked up an order for a business office across town. When I arrived, the parking lot was empty, not a single car around. The building was 2 stories narrow, and all the lights were off except a faint one behind the front door. I checked the app for delivery instructions. Leave the order outside room 232, which I assumed was on the 2nd floor. I pushed the door open, it was unlocked, and stepped inside. Silence, nothing. Just the white noise from the overhead fluorescent lights. The hallways were lined with numbered doors, all dark. I walked to the staircase leading upstairs, held open by a wedge. The stairwell was pitch black. My gut started to tighten. Something felt very wrong. I considered leaving the order downstairs, but the instructions were clear. Suddenly, a man appeared. He came out of one of the rooms on the 1st floor. He wasn't dressed like an office worker, just street clothes. He stood there silently, watching me, his eyes fixed on mine. Then he pointed toward the stairwell without saying a word. My stomach dropped. I nodded, dropped the order, and quickly walked back toward the exit. I heard footsteps go upstairs. The man didn't follow me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the place was a trap. The next day, the police called me. CCTV showed 3 people breaking into the office that night. The man I saw downstairs was one of them. The other 2 were hiding at the top of the stairs, seemingly waiting for a delivery driver to go upstairs. Had I gone to room 232, I might have walked right into them. It was chilling to realize that my ordinary late-night delivery could have turned into something far worse. The building was set up like a trap, and I had been lucky to escape. I still think about how close I was to walking into a nightmare.